sky broke open that night as if heaven itself had turned against the Texas plains. Rain slashed through the darkness, wind howled across the valley, and lightning carved wild shapes against the cliffs. Inside a lonely cabin built from rough cedar logs, Luke Harding tightened the shutters and tossed another log into the fire. He had lived alone for 2 years now, ever since the border war had taken his brother and left him with more ghosts than memories. The storm was nothing new. Loneliness wasn't either. But the sound he heard then, faint, fragile, human, cut through the storm like a cry from another world. A woman's voice, trembling and weak. Luke froze, listening again. The sound came from the ridge carried by the wind, a whimper half lost in the rain. Against all reason, Luke grabbed his rifle, lit a lantern, and stepped outside. Rain slapped his face, soaking him to the bone. He followed the voice, boots sinking into mud, until his lantern light fell across something small and broken in the grass. A young Comanche girl, barely conscious, her long black hair plastered to her face, blood streaking her arm. Her dress was torn, her feet bare, and one look told him she had been running, hunted. Luke knelt, rifle still in hand, torn between compassion and fear. The Comanche were at war with settlers. Just a month ago, a ranch 2 valleys north had been burned. He could almost hear his brother's voice whispering, "You can't save everyone, Luke, especially not the enemy." But then she opened her eyes. Large, dark, filled with pain and terror. Not the eyes of an enemy. The eyes of someone who had seen death coming. Luke hesitated only a moment more before slinging his rifle over his shoulder and lifting her into his arms. "You'll freeze out here," he muttered. She didn't understand his words, but she gripped his coat weakly, trusting him. That small gesture, that blind trust, was enough. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, casting flickering gold across her skin. She couldn't be more than 18. Her cheek was cut, her ankle swollen, and she trembled uncontrollably. Luke found his mother's old blanket, wrapping her tightly. He heated water, crushed dried herbs, and did what little he could to clean the wound. She winced but didn't pull away. Hours passed. The storm howled, the walls shook, but the cabin became a small island of light. Luke sat across from her, watching her drift in and out of sleep. For the first time in years, the silence felt alive, filled not with loneliness but something else. Something fragile. He tried to speak to her. "Who did this to you?" No answer. Only her frightened eyes following his every move. He pointed to her ankle. "Hurts?" She nodded slowly. "Soldiers?" He asked next, miming a rifle. She flinched, then whispered one word. "Blue." The word hit him hard. Blue coats, U.S. soldiers. She hadn't been running from her people. She'd been running from his. Luke stared into the fire for a long time after she fell asleep. He knew what he'd done was dangerous. If the Comanche found her here, they'd think he had taken her prisoner. If the soldiers found her, they'd think he was harboring the enemy. Either way, he'd hang. But something about her, the way she'd clutched his sleeve, the way her voice cracked on that single word, had reached a place in him he thought had died with his brother. He remembered when he used to believe there was still goodness worth protecting in this land. Maybe that was why he hadn't left her to die. When dawn crept over the plains, the storm had passed. Mist clung to the hills and sunlight began to break through the clouds. Luke stepped outside, breathing the scent of wet earth and cedar. The world looked washed clean, as if everything bad had been carried away by the rain. But deep inside he felt a chill that no sun could warm. He turned when he heard her behind him. She had woken and wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, standing in the doorway. She looked smaller now, fragile but proud. Her eyes, though wary, met his with steady strength. Luke spoke softly. "You're safe here. No one's gonna hurt you." She tilted her head, not understanding. He pointed to the woods. "No soldiers," then to his heart. "Safe." For a moment her eyes softened. Then she said something in her own tongue, a whisper that carried sorrow and gratitude all at once. Luke didn't know what it meant, but he felt it. She tried to walk, stumbled, and he caught her before she fell. Their faces were inches apart, her breath trembling, his heart pounding like thunder in his chest. He pulled back quickly, clearing his throat. "You need rest. I'll make food." She nodded faintly, watching him with a look that said more than words ever could. A look that held both fear and a strange, reluctant trust. That night, as the firelight danced across the walls again, Luke listened to the wind moving through the pines. The girl slept beside the hearth, her breathing soft and steady. He didn't even know her name. Yet somehow her presence filled every corner of the cabin. The warmth, the sound, the pulse of life he'd forgotten he needed. He should have been afraid of what morning would bring. He wasn't. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone, but far beyond the hills, beneath the same moonlight, drums were beating. A father's grief echoed through the night. Chief Ten Bears, the most feared Comanche war chief on the plains, had discovered his daughter missing. Scouts returned with word that her trail led toward the settlers' valley. By dawn, 70 warriors rode out in silence. Luke couldn't know that the kindness he'd offered would set the prairie on fire. He couldn't know that by sheltering her, he had crossed an invisible line between peace and war, love and death. But the wind outside seemed to whisper warning, carrying with it the distant rhythm of hooves. And as he looked at her sleeping face in the firelight, he made a silent promise that whatever storm came next, he wouldn't let her be taken again. That promise, made in the quiet of a cabin at dawn, would soon test everything he was, and bind his heart to hers in a way neither of them could escape. The rain had washed the land clean, but the silence that followed felt heavy, too heavy. Luke Harding stood outside his cabin at dawn, a rifle slung over his shoulder, scanning the horizon. The plains stretched endlessly, still veiled in silver mist. Every sound seemed sharper: the cry of a hawk, the whisper of wind through wet grass, the crackle of the dying fire inside. Behind him, the girl stirred. She was awake now, sitting beside the hearth with the blanket wrapped around her. Her hair, black as wet ink, tumbled down her shoulders, and her dark eyes followed his every movement. She looked stronger this morning, less frightened, more watchful. Luke stepped back inside. "You're up," he said quietly, though he knew she wouldn't understand. Still, he spoke. His voice was low, careful, like talking to a wild creature that might bolt. "You can rest here until you can walk. Then I'll take you south. There's a trading post near the river. You'll be safe there." She tilted her head slightly, her brows knitting. "Trade?" she repeated, testing the word. Luke froze, surprised. She knew some English, barely, but enough to make his chest tighten with a strange, rising hope. "Yes," he said, nodding. "Trade, food, horses." Her lips moved silently, shaping the words again as if tasting their sound. Then, with effort, she said softly, "You, not soldier?" The question struck him harder than he expected. "No," he said after a moment. "Not anymore." She studied him, eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing truth from lie. Her gaze lingered on his hands, strong but scarred, and the rifle that leaned against the doorframe. He didn't look like the soldiers who had hunted her. His clothes were plain, his beard rough, his eyes tired but kind. Finally, she nodded once, a small gesture that felt like a fragile truce. "You help," she murmured. "Why?" Luke hesitated. Why indeed? He didn't have a simple answer. Maybe because he'd seen too much death. Maybe because he was tired of burying strangers and calling it survival. Or maybe because when he'd seen her bleeding in the mud, something inside him, the part that still believed in decency, had refused to look away. He sighed and said simply, "Because no one should die out there alone." She watched him with a quiet intensity that made him uneasy. It wasn't fear anymore. It was curiosity. Her gaze swept around the small cabin, the wooden walls, the table he'd built by hand, the old photograph of his brother above the hearth. She rose slowly, still limping, and touched the photograph. "Who?" Luke followed her eyes and swallowed hard. "My brother, Samuel. Dead?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Long time now." Something flickered in her expression, a shadow of understanding. She reached into the small pouch that hung around her neck, drawing out a strip of deerskin with tiny beads woven through it. She showed it to him. "My brother," she said. Then, after a pause, "He die?" "Soldiers." The room went quiet again. Two people from opposite worlds, both marked by loss, stood facing each other across a chasm of language and grief. Luke felt his chest tighten. He didn't know her name, her tribe, or her story. But in that single shared silence, he understood her more than he had understood anyone in years. Hours passed. The sun rose higher, drying the earth outside. Luke fetched water from the stream and tried to fix a broken fence post, though his eyes kept drifting back to the cabin window. Each time he looked in, she was watching him, silent, curious, as if studying the shape of the man who had defied both fate and fear to save her. When he returned, she was trying to walk without the blanket, using a chair for balance. He set down the bucket quickly. "Whoa, easy," he said, moving toward her. She stumbled once and he caught her arm. The contact sent a jolt through him. Her skin was warm, her pulse quick beneath his hand. "Rest," he said, helping her sit. "You'll tear that ankle worse." She looked up at him, her face close to his. Her voice was barely a whisper. "You good man?" Luke blinked. "No," he said quietly. "Just trying to be." She smiled faintly. Her first smile since he'd found her. It was small and uncertain, but it was enough to make his heart feel something it hadn't in years. That night, after dinner of beans and cornbread, they sat near the fire again. The girl had begun to trust him enough to eat, to speak a few more broken words. Luke poured her water, then pointed to himself. "Luke." She hesitated, then pointed to herself. "Naira," she said softly. "Naira," he repeated, the name rolling off his tongue like a secret. "That's beautiful." Her eyes lifted. "Mean moonlight," she said slowly, as if sharing something sacred. Luke smiled. "It suits you." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was warm, alive. The fire popped, casting gold light across her skin. Outside, the night hummed with crickets. Then unexpectedly, she began to hum, a low, haunting melody that seemed to rise from the heart of the plains itself. Luke froze, listening. The song was ancient, wordless, yet full of longing. It spoke of journeys, loss, and stars that watched over lonely hearts. When she stopped, he asked quietly, "What's it mean?" She thought for a long time before answering. "Home," she said finally, "and love." He looked into the fire, feeling something stir deep inside. The way she said the word love was different, soft, reverent, as if it meant not just passion but belonging. Later, as she slept, Luke sat awake, watching the flames die down. He couldn't stop thinking about her courage, her gentleness, her eyes that seemed to carry both the wildness of the plains and the sadness of exile. He also couldn't stop thinking about the risk. If anyone saw her here, they'd kill him for sure. The soldiers would hang him for treason. The Comanche would gut him for kidnapping their chief's daughter, though he didn't know yet that that's who she was. But when he looked at her sleeping form, wrapped in his blanket, her hand curled near her face like a child's, all he felt was peace. It had been so long since he'd felt that. Peace, quiet, the sound of another heartbeat in the same room. Maybe that was what frightened him most. Because peace never lasted long in a land like this. Just before dawn, he woke to the distant sound of thunder, or what he thought was thunder. But the rhythm was too steady, too deliberate. The sound grew louder, echoing off the valley walls, the drumming of hooves. Luke's blood went cold. He rose silently, grabbed his rifle, and went to the door. The horizon was still gray with mist, but through it he could see faint movement, shadows against the rising sun. One, then 5, then dozens more. Riders. He turned back toward the cabin, heart hammering. Naira was awake now, her eyes wide with sudden, terrible understanding. She whispered a word that chilled him. "Father." Luke froze. "What?" She swallowed hard, tears welling in her eyes. "Father, Chief Ten Bears," her voice trembled. "He come, with many." Outside, the sound of hooves multiplied, 70 strong, encircling the valley like a noose tightening around his cabin. For a moment, Luke couldn't breathe. Everything made sense now. The quality of her beads, the markings on her dress, the fire in her eyes. She wasn't just a girl from a wandering band. She was the daughter of one of the most feared war chiefs on the plains. He turned toward her, every muscle tight. "They'll think I took you," he said, voice low. "They'll kill me, Naira." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "I tell them no," she whispered. "I tell them you help." Luke gave a bitter, hopeless laugh. "You think they'll listen?" Her lip quivered. "Maybe." "My father, listen." The sound outside grew louder. Shouting now, horses snorting, war cries carried on the wind. Luke looked at her one last time, then stepped to the window, rifle ready, eyes hard. He'd faced storms, wolves, soldiers, but nothing like this. And yet, as fear gripped his chest, he looked back at Naira and felt something stronger than fear. Something worth fighting for. That morning, the sun rose over a cabin surrounded by 70 warriors. The air crackled with tension and gunpowder. And in the heart of it all, 2 people stood. One who had given shelter and one who had found it, and the first fragile threads of love trembled beneath the weight of a coming war. The first light of dawn spread across the Texas plains, soft and golden, touching the grass like fire. But to Luke Harding it wasn't sunrise, and it was warning. The air itself seemed to tremble. From the ridge above his cabin came the sound of hooves, hundreds of them, moving with the rhythm of thunder. Luke stepped onto his porch, rifle in hand, boots sinking into the damp earth. His heart hammered in his chest as he counted shadows on the ridge, dozens upon dozens of mounted warriors, their faces painted, their lances gleaming with the rising sun, and at their center, on a white horse draped in eagle feathers and red cloth, sat Chief 10 Bears, broad-shouldered, grim, his eyes like the dark horizon before a storm. Inside the cabin, Naira clutched the edge of the window, trembling. She had warned Luke, but even she hadn't imagined her father would bring 70 warriors. They moved like one body, silent but powerful, surrounding the cabin in a wide circle. Smoke rose from their torches, curling through the morning mist. Luke lowered his rifle but didn't put it away. He wasn't foolish. He knew what this looked like. A white man's cabin, a Comanche girl inside. Her father, a war chief, outside with his warriors. There was no way this would end clean. Naira limped to him, her voice breaking. "You no shoot, my father. Think you steal me. You die if shoot." Luke looked down at her, jaw tight. "Then what am I supposed to do, Naira? Invite him in for breakfast?" Her eyes pleaded. "I talk. I make peace." He stared at her for a long moment. Every instinct told him to run, to grab his rifle, his horse, and make for the hills. But something in her face, the raw desperation and courage, stopped him. She wasn't just a frightened girl now. She was a daughter standing between two worlds about to crash together. "All right," he said finally, "but if he makes a move, I protect us both. You understand?" She nodded, tears glinting in her lashes. 10 Bears raised his hand, and the circle of warriors halted. His voice boomed across the valley, deep and resonant. "White man, you hold my blood in your house. Come out now and maybe you live." Luke swallowed hard. He turned to Naira. "Tell him I didn't harm you. Tell him I saved you." She stepped forward, calling out in her native tongue, her voice high and trembling but steady. The language rolled like music through the air, ancient and wild. Luke couldn't understand the words, but he could feel their weight. The plea of a daughter asking for mercy. For a long time, there was only silence. Then the chief rode closer, stopping a few yards from the porch. His eyes were fixed on Luke, sharp as a hawk's. When he spoke again, his tone was colder. "You think my daughter needs white man's help? You lie. You take her for trade, for shame. You will die slow." Luke clenched his jaw. He didn't need a translator to feel the hatred in the chief's voice. He stepped forward, lowering his rifle deliberately and raising his empty hands. "I didn't take her," he said, voice strong but calm. "I found her in the storm, wounded. I gave her shelter. That's all." 10 Bears stared at him in silence, his expression unreadable. Then he barked something sharp in Comanche. 2 warriors dismounted and advanced toward the cabin. Naira cried out, stepping between them and Luke. "No! He help! He saved me!" she shouted, voice breaking into English. "He not soldier, he good." Her words hung in the air, a fragile bridge between war and peace. The warriors froze. 10 Bear's eyes flickered, confusion crossing his hard face. "He save?" he repeated, disbelieving. She nodded furiously, tears streaking down her cheeks. "Blue soldiers hurt me. He find me, he give fire, food. He no hurt." The chief said nothing for a long moment. His gaze moved from his daughter to the man standing behind her. Luke didn't flinch. He stood tall, bareheaded, rain-soaked, his rifle lowered, his heart pounding like a drum. 10 Bears dismounted slowly. The earth seemed to still. He walked toward Luke, stopping only a few feet away. The 2 men faced each other, the frontier between 2 worlds drawn in the dirt at their feet. "You speak truth?" the chief said in rough English. Luke nodded once. "I do. You not fear death?" Luke's mouth twisted into a wry half-smile. "I've met it before. Doesn't scare me much anymore." Something flickered in the chief's eyes, something that almost looked like respect. Naira moved closer to her father, clutching his arm, speaking softly in Comanche. Her words were too low for Luke to understand, but he caught the rhythm of her voice, pleading, desperate, honest. Finally, 10 Bears raised a hand to silence her. He turned to his men and barked an order. The warriors hesitated, then slowly pulled back their circle, though their hands stayed close to their weapons. Naira exhaled shakily. Luke, too, felt his lungs finally release the breath he'd been holding. 10 bears stepped closer to the cabin door and looked around. "You care for her," he said flatly. It wasn't a question. Luke hesitated, then said quietly, "Yes, I do." The chief's gaze hardened again. "Then you fool. My people and yours, never peace. You keep her here, she die. You die." "I didn't keep her," Luke said firmly. "I saved her because it was right." The chief's expression softened just slightly. He looked at his daughter, fragile, fierce, her hand still gripping his sleeve. Then he looked back at Luke. "You white man with heart like warrior," he said, "but heart bring death." He turned to his daughter and spoke again in Comanche. She shook her head violently, her voice breaking. "No, I not go. I stay." Luke felt the air leave his chest. "Naira." She turned to him, her eyes wide, glistening. "He take me back, but I not want go." Her father's voice cut through her words. "You belong with your people. Not this man." For the first time, Luke saw something behind the chief's anger. Fear. A father's fear of losing his daughter, not to war, but to a world he didn't understand. The standoff stretched into silence. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of smoke and horse sweat. Finally, Luke said quietly, "If she wants to go, I won't stop her. But I didn't harm her. You know that." The chief looked at him for a long, unreadable moment. Then he nodded once curtly. "You speak true." He mounted his horse, gripping the reins tightly. "You live today, white man. But next time stay away from Comanche path." Naira cried out again, reaching for Luke. "Please." He stepped toward her, but 2 warriors blocked his path. Her father spoke sharply, pulling her back onto his horse. Her cries echoed across the valley as the war party turned and began to ride away, the thunder of hooves fading into the distance. Luke stood motionless, watching until the horizon swallowed them whole. Only when the last echo died did he let his rifle fall to the ground. His hands shook. The cabin felt emptier than ever. He looked to the ridge where dust still hung in the air and whispered her name under his breath. Naira. He didn't know it yet, but her leaving wasn't the end. It was the beginning, because the next time she came back, it wouldn't be as the daughter of his enemy, but as the woman who would challenge the world for him. That morning, Luke walked back into the silent cabin. The fire had burned down to embers. On the table beside the bowl she'd eaten from lay something small, a strip of deerskin strung with white and red beads. Her brother's token. She'd left it behind. Luke picked it up, closing his hand around it. It was still warm. Outside, the sky was bright and endless, but to him it felt like twilight. Somewhere beyond the hills, 70 warriors rode home, carrying his heart with them. And in the stillness of that lonely cabin, Luke knew he would never forget the girl who had brought light into his world, and whose absence now felt like the quiet before another storm. 3 weeks passed since the day the valley thundered with hooves. 3 weeks since Luke watched Naira vanish over the ridge, the echo of her cries haunting him long after the dust settled. The plains were quiet now, too quiet. Each day he rose before dawn, fixed his fences, tended his horses, and tried to pretend he didn't keep looking toward the hills. But every night, when the fire burned low, he could still see her, standing in the doorway of his cabin, her dark hair tangled with rain, her voice whispering his name. Luke had known loneliness before. This was different. This was ache. He tried to convince himself she was safe with her people, tried to bury his longing beneath work and whiskey, but the emptiness stayed, a wound that refused to close. Then one night, as the moon hung full over the plains, he heard it. The faint sound of hooves again. Slow, careful, almost hesitant, he gripped his rifle and stepped onto the porch. The world was silver and still. Out of the darkness rode a single figure on a small paint horse. For a heartbeat, Luke thought he was dreaming. Then she lifted her head and the moonlight caught her face. Naira. He froze, his breath leaving him all at once. She looked thinner, tired, her dress travel-worn, but her eyes, those deep, fearless eyes, were the same. She dismounted slowly. "Luke," she whispered, her voice trembling but sure. He could barely speak. "Naira, what are you doing here?" "I come," she said haltingly, searching for words, because I cannot stay there. My father say forget you. My people say you enemy, but I remember Storm. I remember you helped me. I remember. Heart. Luke stared at her, torn between joy and fear. You shouldn't have come. If they find you here, they will not, she said quickly. I ride at night. I hide in canyon. I come to tell truth. Truth? He asked softly. She looked up, eyes bright with tears. Soldiers come. They go to my village. They say white man hide chief's daughter, want fight. My father say no. Soldiers say lie. They come soon. Here. Luke's stomach dropped. Here? She nodded. They come to kill you. They think you steal me. My father try stop, but soldiers no listen. For a long moment, the night itself seemed to hold its breath. Luke lowered his rifle and stepped toward her. You came to warn me. Yes. You risked your life for me. Yes. She whispered again, voice trembling. Because I love you. The word struck him harder than any bullet. He froze, staring at her, heart pounding. He had felt it, that fragile, forbidden thread between them. But hearing her say it was like standing in sunlight after years of cold. He reached for her, his hands cupping her face gently. Naira. She closed her eyes, tears slipping free. I know wrong. My people say I cannot love you. But heart not listen. Heart remember fire, rain, kindness. Luke pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. I don't care what anyone says, he whispered. You're here. That's all that matters. Their lips met, soft, uncertain, but real. For a moment the world fell away. No war, no fear, no lines between them. Just the two of them, bound by something stronger than any law of men or tribe. But love, in the West, never came without danger. The next morning, Luke saw the dust first, a rising cloud on the far edge of the plains. Through his spyglass he counted at least 20 riders, soldiers. Their blue coats glinted in the sun. Damn, he muttered, lowering the glass. Naira stood behind him, her face pale. They come. Yes, he said grimly. And they'll shoot first, ask later. He turned to her, voice hardening. You need to ride, now, go back to your people. She shook her head. No, I stay. Naira, she stepped closer, her voice fierce. If I go, they kill you. If I stay, maybe I stop them, my words. Maybe change. Luke clenched his jaw. Every instinct screamed to protect her, to get her out. But when he saw the fire in her eyes, he knew she wouldn't run. She had the same stubborn courage her father had, and the same pride. All right, he said finally. We'll face them together. The soldiers arrived an hour later, led by a captain with cold gray eyes and a scar down his cheek. They dismounted, rifles drawn. Luke stepped out first, hands raised. Easy now. No need for guns, the captain sneered. You Harding? Yeah. We've had reports you're harboring a Comanche woman. That true? Luke's jaw tightened. She's here, yes. But I didn't take her. She came on her own. The captain laughed harshly. On her own? You expect me to believe that? They don't come here unless dragged. Behind Luke, Naira stepped forward. I come, she said clearly, though her accent was heavy. He saved me. You lie. The captain's expression twisted. Well, isn't that something? The little savage speaks. He raised his pistol. Step aside, Harding. We'll take her. Luke's heart pounded. No, the captain blinked. What did you say? I said no, Luke repeated, voice low and steady. She's done nothing wrong. You'll have to go through me. The soldiers raised their rifles. For a moment it felt like the world stopped breathing. Then the sound of hooves shattered the silence again from the hills. Dozens more riders, not soldiers this time. Comanche 10 bears rode at their front, his face like stone. His warriors fanned out, forming a wall of horses and lances between the soldiers and Luke's cabin. The captain cursed, spinning his horse. God Almighty. 10 bears raised his hand, voice thunderous. You touch my daughter, I take your heads. Luke exhaled sharply. He looked at Naira. He came for you. No, she said softly. He come for peace. The standoff burned like fire. Blue coats on one side, war paint on the other, the air thick with gunpowder and pride. Luke stood in the middle between two worlds. The captain snarled, We're on U.S. soil, Chief, stand down. 10 bears' eyes narrowed. Soil of who? Blood of who? The soldiers shifted, tense, ready to fire. Luke stepped forward, his voice breaking the tension. Enough! Every head turned toward him. This land's seen enough killing. She's not a hostage. She's proof we don't have to be enemies, the captain sneered. You'll hang for this, Harding. Maybe, Luke said quietly. But not today. He turned to 10 Bears. She's your daughter. I'll never keep her from you. But she came back to save my life. Don't let her die for trying to do what's right. 10 Bears studied him for a long moment, a silence that stretched like eternity. Then he spoke to his warriors in Comanche. Slowly, they lowered their weapons. He turned to the captain. You go, take your soldiers. We fight no more today. The captain's jaw tightened, but faced with 70 armed warriors, he spat in the dirt and signaled retreat. The soldiers turned their horses and rode off, dust trailing behind them. When the last of them vanished, the chief looked back at Luke. You protect her. You speak truth. You fight like warrior, not for blood, but for heart. I see that now. Naira's eyes filled with tears. Father. 10 Bears looked at her for a long time. Then he said softly, you have my blessing. But your path will be hard. The world not ready for your love. He touched her cheek, turned his horse, and rode away, leaving them standing in silence as the morning sun climbed higher. Luke turned to Naira, barely able to believe what had just happened. You did it, he whispered. You stopped a war. She smiled faintly, tears shining like diamonds. No, she said. We did. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as the wind swept across the plains, carrying away the last echo of war. In that moment, surrounded by the vastness of the frontier, Luke knew he'd found something rarer than gold, stronger than fear, the kind of love that bridges blood and mercy, tribe and outcast, silence and forever. The days after the standoff passed like waking from a fever dream. The soldiers never returned. 10 Bears and his warriors vanished into the hills before dawn, leaving only the whisper of hoofbeats and the memory of their eyes, fierce, proud, and unbroken. Luke's homestead stood quiet once more. But it wasn't the same silence it had been before. The silence now was filled, and with breath, with hope, with the sound of two people learning how to live in a world that had nearly torn them apart. The morning after the soldiers left, Naira walked barefoot through the cabin, touching everything as if seeing it for the first time. The rough-hewn table, the rifle above the door, the tiny carved horse Luke had whittled for her weeks ago still sitting on the mantel. When her fingers brushed it, she smiled softly. Luke watched her from the doorway. He had no words, and only the quiet gratitude that she was there, alive and free. You should sleep, he said finally. You've been riding for days. I cannot, she murmured. When I close eyes, I see guns, faces, war. He nodded slowly, understanding too well. Yeah, he said. Me too. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then she reached for his hand. Her fingers were cold, but her touch was steady. Luke, she whispered, what will happen now? He looked at her, at the uncertainty in her eyes, and beneath it the stubborn courage he'd come to love. I don't know, he admitted. But whatever comes, we face it together. Her lips curved faintly. Together, she echoed, as if testing the word. Then she leaned into his chest, listening to the slow beat of his heart until the world felt steady again. Days became weeks. They built a rhythm, a quiet, fragile kind of peace. Luke repaired the fences and gathered supplies from the nearby town, though each trip carried danger. The settlers still whispered about the Comanche girl living under his roof. Some called him traitor, others fool. But Luke didn't care. He'd spent years watching men fight for gold, for land, for pride. For once, he wanted to fight for something that mattered. Naira tended the horses, learned to bake bread, and helped patch the roof before the spring rains came. She moved through the cabin like a soft wind, changing everything without even meaning to. The place that once felt empty now smelled of wild sage and fresh cornmeal. The walls seemed warmer. At night, she taught Luke words in her language, slow, careful syllables that rolled like music off her tongue. Namunu, she said once, touching his chest. It means my person. He smiled faintly. My person, huh? She nodded. Yes, you are. Luke couldn't speak for a moment. He just reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Then you're mine too. And in the flickering firelight, they kissed, slow and unhurried. The kind of kiss that didn't promise forever, but believed in it anyway. But love in the frontier never stayed untouched for long. One morning, Luke rode into the nearby town of Redwater to trade for flour and salt. The streets grew quiet when he entered. Men leaned on porch rails, spitting tobacco. Women turned away, whispering behind gloved hands. At the general store, the shopkeeper, Old Jeb Collins narrowed his eyes. "Hardin," he said slowly, weighing the words. "Heard tell you got yourself a squaw out there." Luke's jaw tightened. "You heard wrong," Jeb smirked. "Don't lie to me, boy. Folks seen her. You bringin' heathens into Christian land now?" Luke set his bag of grain on the counter a little too hard. "You want my money or not?" Jeb's smirk faded. "You watch yourself, Hardin. Men round here don't take kindly to your kind of hospitality. Might find yourself run out before long." Luke stared him down, his voice low. "If any man sets foot on my land uninvited, I'll send him back to town on a stretcher. That plain enough for you?" Jeb swallowed hard. Luke paid and left without another word. As he rode home, his gut twisted. He'd known it was coming. The judgment, the hate. But hearing it out loud made it real. The world wasn't built for what they had. That night he sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Naira came to him quietly, wrapping her shawl around his shoulders. "You angry?" she said softly. He nodded. "They'll never understand." "Then we teach," she said simply. He looked at her, startled. "Teach?" "Yes," she said. "Not with words. With life, we live. We show them what love looks like." Her words were simple, but they cut deep. He took her hand, rough fingers entwining with hers. "You think it'll ever be enough?" She smiled faintly. "It already is." Spring melted into summer. Wildflowers spread across the plains like spilled paint. The grass grew high and golden. Luke and Naira worked side by side, building a small corral, planting corn near the creek, painting the cabin shutters bright red. Sometimes when the evening wind rose, she would stand outside and sing, soft, haunting songs in her tongue that drifted across the prairie. The horses would lift their heads to listen. Even the coyotes stayed quiet. Luke loved her most then, when the world felt vast and she seemed like its center. But not all eyes were kind. One evening, as Luke rode back from town, he spotted smoke on the horizon. His smoke. His heart slammed in his chest. He kicked his horse hard, flying across the plains. When he reached the homestead, he found the barn ablaze. Flames devoured the roof, and Naira stood outside coughing, trying to save the horses. "Luke!" she cried. He leapt from the saddle, threw a blanket over his face, and ran in beside her. Together they freed the animals, guiding them into the field. By the time the roof caved, they were covered in soot, trembling but alive. Naira fell to her knees, tears streaking her face. "Who do this?" Luke looked at the scorched ground, his jaw clenched. He didn't need to guess. "Men from town," he said bitterly. "They're sending a message." She looked up at him, fierce and proud despite the tears. "Then we send one back." The next day, Luke rode into Redwater again, not with anger, but with Naira beside him. Heads turned. Doors shut, but Luke kept his head high, his hand steady on the reins. They stopped in front of the church. The preacher came out, startled, clutching his Bible. Luke met his eyes. "You talk about love and mercy every Sunday. I want you to show it." The preacher hesitated. "This woman saved my life," Luke said, voice ringing through the square. "She stood between two armies and stopped a war." "If you call that sin, then I don't need your kind of faith," the crowd murmured. Some looked away, but a few, a mother holding her child, an old rancher near the well, nodded quietly. Seeds of change, small but real. The preacher said nothing, but he didn't turn them away either. Weeks later, under a violet sky, Luke and Naira stood together by the creek. The barn had been rebuilt. The wheat field shimmered gold. He took her hands, rough palms against soft fingers. "You sure about this?" he asked. She smiled. "I am." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple band, made from a melted-down rifle casing, polished until it gleamed. "It ain't much," he said, "but it's honest." She looked at it, then at him. "It's everything." He slid it onto her finger. "Then it's done. No priest. No witnesses. Just the sky, the land, and the quiet promise between them." That night they sat on the porch, wrapped in one blanket. The stars stretched endless above, the same ones that watched over both their worlds. Luke whispered, "What are you thinking?" She smiled softly. "That we are small. But love is big," he kissed her temple. "Then we'll make the world see it." The wind stirred the grass, carrying the scent of sage and smoke, of endings and beginnings. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Comanche rode their trails again. Somewhere else, soldiers still patrolled. The frontier was far from peaceful. But here, On one small patch of earth under a sky as wide as forever, two souls had built something no bullet could destroy, a promise across two worlds.